Before we begin, I'd like to request you all to turn with me to the passage that has been allotted to me this morning, and that is from the Gospel according to St. Matthew and chapter 21. Please turn with me to Matthew and chapter 21. Last week, we heard the first part of this chapter, verse 1, all the way through to verse 22, beautifully outlined by the power of the Spirit through Steve, and we will be looking at the second part of the chapter this morning, verse 23 all the way through to verse 46. Now, before I begin, I'd like to just ask you a question. I see that a lot of us are, quite serious here this morning. So if you can just loosen yourselves a bit in the next 20 to 25 minutes, we'll see what God has to speak to us from this passage in Matthew 21. All right, so I'll start with a question. What do Post-its, the Skittles, and a Rubik's Cube have in common? Okay, I see a couple of hands. I'll probably give Michelle a chance. They are rainbows. Okay, that's a good observation. Maybe let me throw in Kinder Surprise eggs into the mixture. Now tell me, the Post-its, the Skittles, the Rubik's Cube, and the Kinder Surprise eggs, what do they have in common? Yes, Jeremiah? They're only used by children? Not sure of that. Yes, please. They have different colors? Yeah, that is true, that is partially true. Anyone else? Okay, so they all turn 50 this year. So, that's right. So, it is not connected to the chapter, the passage that we are going to look at this morning. But the reason why I asked this question is because when you look into the passage this morning, you'll find a lot of questions. So when you look into this passage here, Jesus is with the scribes, the chief priests, and the Pharisees, and we see, questions asked, back and forth. In the Gospels, if you look at the Gospels, it is estimated that Jesus is asked more than 180 questions. So people, when they came to Jesus, they asked him a lot of questions, more than 180. Some estimate 183, some estimate 187. And, because we've got the long weekend and if you have plenty of time in your hands, probably you could count that up and let everyone know next week the exact number of questions you could find. So it is believed that Jesus is asked more than 180 questions. Now, of all these questions, do you know how many Jesus answered? I don't need an exact figure because it depends on how you view it, but just you can just probably take a guess. 8, okay. Anyone else? So, the answers vary from 3 all the way to 8, depending on how you view the response of Jesus. So, of the 180 questions that Jesus has asked, there's probably only half a dozen questions that Jesus answered. All right? And now with that at the backdrop of your mind, the next statistic that I wanted, to share this morning was that Jesus himself asked 307 questions. I know there are a lot of numbers here, right? So Jesus, he asked questions at least 307 times in the gospel. So for all the questions he's been asked, he probably answered, 1 out of every 30 questions that was posed to him. And then he goes on to ask almost double the number of questions he was asked in the first place. Now with that at the backdrop, let's look at this passage. If one of you could please read out verse 23 loudly.
Now when he came into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people confronted him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?"
So here we see 2 questions being asked to Jesus. Okay, so they were here and they see Jesus doing a lot of things. Steve already mentioned last week, that Jesus is here in the last week of his mortal life in this earth. There's the triumphal entry, and then very soon he's going to be put to death. So he's got just a few days remaining in his hands, And then Jesus, he's doing all these wonderful things. And the question they had, or the questions they had, was the first thing is, by what authority are you doing these things? You're going around doing a lot of things. By what authority are you doing this thing? It did not stop there. And they also wanted to know, who gave you the authority to do these things? Now, I was thinking, what must have been going on in their minds for them to ask this question? We know that the Jewish people, they knew that they were subject to authority. And, if you look at the background of this, for almost 500 years, there has not been a God's appointed prophet in the land. 500 years. God always raised, people in different dispensations and gave them different titles and used them in different ways. God walked with them, in the garden, in the cool of the day with Adam, and he spoke to him like a friend. And very soon, God would make appearances to people like Abraham in order to convey a message to them. Very soon, there would be priests who would put those two rocks, Urim and Thummim, into their robe, and God would use, these stones, through these stones, or stones as a medium, to convey their message through the priests to the children of Israel. And then after that, God would raise up leaders like Moses and Joshua and use them, and through them pass on a message to the children of Israel. And then after that, God would raise up judges, and God would pass on the message that he had for the children of Israel through the judges. And then God would raise up kings, and God would use them as a means to rule his children with authority. And then we will see the time of the prophets. We read about the major prophets, the minor prophets, and God would use these prophets, and through their symbolic actions and through their words and through the visions they had, God would communicate messages to the children of Israel. So right from the beginning of humanity, right from the cradle of humanity, right from the time of Adam, for almost 4,000 and more years, God has been communicating with man by different means. Of course, the office and the titles and the roles changed, but one thing that did not change was God, and one thing that did not change was his message. The people changed. They were born, they died. The next generation came in, they died. It went on and on. But God kept communicating with the children of God. So Israelites, the Jews, they knew that they were subject to an authority. They sought authority. But for the last 500 years, there has not been a God's appointed prophet in the land. After the times of Malachi, for almost 430 or 450 years, by the time this unfolds, there has been a quiet time. There has been an intertestamental gap, which we call as the dark period. God is not communicating anymore with his children. And a lot of changes are happening around in this world. The world is preparing for the arrival of a Savior. A lot of changes are happening. There is going to be a global language in the form of Greek. There is going to be a global empire in the form of the Roman Empire. There is going to be a great deal of increase and establishment of religious groups in Israel, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. These groups never existed in the Old Testament times. The Roman Empire did not exist in the Old Testament times until Malachi was written. The Greek language was not a big language until the end of the Old Testament. But all these changes are happening. God is quiet. He's letting all these changes happen and unfold. And the people are in the dark. And the only authorities they knew with all things pertaining to the religion were the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees. They were the self-appointed custodians of the law. And they had the final say in matters of religion. So these Pharisees who were under that impression, they considered themselves as the figures of authority. Now that is what was going on in their mind. Now when they knew that they were the figures of authority, they wanted to know, who Jesus is. He wasn't a Pharisee. He wasn't a scribe. He was the son of a carpenter. And he's coming into the temple and he's doing all these things. So it's only natural that they would come to him and ask him, by what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you that authority? Is it one of us? Did you get the authority from any one of us? Did we delegate any responsibility to you? That's what is going on in their mind. And in terms of authority, if you look at it, we will understand that these Jews were trying to undermine whatever Jesus was doing. They saw everything that Jesus did, but they could not understand how he was doing what he was doing. Right? They could really see the lame man walk. They could really see the blind man see. If not, imagine if these things did not happen, they could have confronted Jesus in the next miracle. They could have told him, the lame man that you perpetually healed, he is limping again, right? The blind man that you healed, he can't see a thing. You claim to do all these things, but there is nothing true. They could have confronted him with that, but they couldn't say any of those things. Why? Because they were able to see with their own eyes that Jesus was truly doing all these miracles and, with utmost authority and power. They were witnesses to that firsthand. Whether they didn't like him do that is a different story altogether. But they couldn't deny the fact that Jesus was doing it with authority and with power. But they didn't understand how he was doing it. Sometimes, because of our limitations, we do not understand some things, right? We witness some things, but we do not understand how those things can happen in the first place. I was, thinking of an illustration of a very old lady in US. She was 70 years old, and she lived in the woods all her life. And she's not, she never saw the city once, and she lived, in the woods in a secluded, remote place all her life. But her daughter got the opportunity to, to move out into a town to study and then eventually move to New York. And the story goes like this, that this daughter, she wanted to bring her mother over to the city and wanted to see her, how a city looks like, how the buildings look like, and, to see the beautiful creation of God outside of the little place that she was always confined to for the whole of her life. And so this lady, she arrives, at New York. She's brought in by someone, and then she comes to the hotel where her daughter works. She's at the lobby, and she is amazed at all the things that's happening around her. She's witnessing these beautiful things, these shiny buildings, all these cars, and all these glamorous things happening around her. She's speechless. She's amazed. And then one thing that caught her attention was the elevator, which was by the lobby of the hotel. And she looks at it, wondering what that box is. And she thinks of it in her mind that, it's something like a magic box. And she sees a very old man walk into that elevator. He's probably in his 90s. He has a cane, and with the help of his cane, he walks into the elevator. He goes in, the door shuts, and then she sees the numbers change at the top. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the numbers go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The doors open, and a young, beautiful, handsome young man walks out. She's amazed, she was surprised. She saw it happen, but she didn't know how. The Pharisees were just like that. They could see Jesus do all these things, but they simply could not understand how he was doing all these things. It was like a magic box in the hands of Jesus. Now, these, this question when the Pharisees, they asked Jesus, we need to understand how zealous they were when it came to religion. Now, we all know that they were ruled by the Romans, right? And the political empire was the Roman Empire. They were one of the greatest empires that ever ruled this earth. Now, even when the Romans had so much power over the Israelites, now listen to this, you'd be surprised. Most of you, would already be aware of this. Now, even when they had so much power, they never interfered into the religious matter of the Jews. Pontius Pilate did try a few things according to the historian Josephus, because he wasn't happy with that. When he was appointed the governor, he does try a few things, but all the Jews, there was an uprising, there was a revolt, and people were ready to die for the cause to uphold their religious freedom. So there was a direct intervention by Caesar himself, that the Jews, when it comes to their religious laws, they will rule themselves. No Roman could ever interfere into the Jewish religious laws and customs. And in fact, I've got a picture up here for you. If you look at it, it's called the Soreg. Now, have any of you been to Istanbul in Turkey? Okay, probably it's a good place to visit sometimes, because you'll find a lot of our antiquities and a lot of things that have been archaeologically excavated in the Middle East, in Turkey. You'd find in UK, in Israel, and a lot of other places. So this Soreg that you see here is an inscription. It was uncovered, I believe, in 1871. And because, I believe most of us do not have the gift of the tongues, it's difficult for us to read what they have written it back then, 2,000 years back. And that inscription just says that no stranger or Gentile was allowed to enter into the prohibited areas of the temple. And if they did, they would be put to death. In fact, the actual wording is, no Gentile or a Roman soldier could enter. Now, they were being ruled by the Romans, right? The Romans had all power on these Jews. But what they're essentially saying, what they had written at the temple, was that even if you're a Roman, if you enter into any place in this temple that is prohibited to a Gentile, you will be put to death. Now, that's the message they had for the occupying power. They were so zealous about it. They were filled with that zeal. They would not let anyone come and do whatever they wanted in their temples. But now, they see Jesus doing all these things. Thank you for that image. We'll close that. So now, they were wondering what Jesus is doing, and they come and ask all these things to Jesus. Now, Jesus here, as I said, 180 questions asked of Jesus and 307 questions that Jesus asked back, and he does exactly the same. He asks a question back. Now, could you please read that question for me?
But Jesus answered and said to them, I also will ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I likewise will tell you by what authority I do these things.
Right. And what was the question?
The baptism of John, where was it from? From heaven or from men?
Right. So it looks like Jesus had already rehearsed all these questions. He had all these questions in mind. If this is the question, this is the anti-question that I would ask. We don't know. He was already prepared. And the questions that he always asked were so sharp. The Pharisees were smart, They do not just jump in and then give an answer, whatever that came through their mind. They did not just jump in and answer. They were able to evaluate all these questions. Do you see that? They were smart people. They could have just said God or from man or, whatever answer that came into their mind, neither or something like that, or pass. But they did not do any such thing. They were smart. They understood that it was a trap. They were evaluating, if you read that verse, they were evaluating their response and the consequences of their response. If I say yes, this is what it would mean for me. If I were to say no, then this is what it would mean for us. They were evaluating the responses, the consequences of their responses. And Jesus asked them this question. If you can answer this question, then I will answer both your questions. So, their question was all about authority, right? So, what is authority? I've got probably another 10 minutes. What is authority? Yes. Right, the power someone has over someone else to make them do something that they want to be done. Yes, that's a good definition, I believe. Anyone else? What is authority? Control, that's right. So control, power, the dictionary definition of that is the power or a right. To give orders, to make decisions, or to enforce obedience. So it's a power, it is also a right. When a cop, stops you, he is exercising his power to do that. When parents discipline their children, they're exercising their rights to do that. And the authority is defined as a power or a right when you do something. Right? So here, they wanted to know who gave Jesus that power and what kind of a power was it in the first place. Now, from the Bible, Jesus does not answer that question here, so we'll have to take the answer from a different passage. And that's the beauty of the Bible, right? You'd find a lot of questions here, you'd find answers interspersed, and then as you go through all these passages and as you study them together, then they are like the pieces of the puzzle that fit together. And it's so beautiful. And especially when you understand that these are all written at different times, different authors in different places, many of them, they haven't even met. You know that there is a single author, there's a single power, which is the Holy Spirit, inspiring them to write all these things. In Romans chapter 13 and verse 1, now very different author there, from our author Matthew here. When he writes in 13 verse 1, let's read that. Let's have a youth read that verse. Romans chapter 13 verse 1.
Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God.
Okay, thank you. We're all youths at heart, so that's all right. So there is no authority except that which God has established. So who establishes authority? God. So, the answer to the questions that the Pharisees posed can be found in Romans chapter 13. So one thing is clear. The presupposition here is that all authority comes from God. All the authorities that exist are established by God. There is no authority, again to put emphasis on that, there is no authority in this world that has not been established by God. So it all comes from God, and He is the ultimate authority. Now, in the book of Matthew, which we are studying, in chapter 11 and verse 27, Jesus says that all these things have been handed over to me by my Father. The authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me by my Father. Jesus affirmed that He had the authority over all things. Who gave Him the authority? We've seen. Where does authority come from? We've seen that verse as well. And Jesus affirmed that He has all the authority. Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. Just for you to make a note, we don't need to read that verse. That verse reads, Then Jesus came to them and said, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. See, the thing was when Jesus spoke, because He had that authority, when Jesus spoke, people were amazed. And that's what Matthew's writing this book. Who was his audience? Who was the audience of Matthew? The Jewish people, right? So he had a Jewish audience. And what does he portray Christ as? Christ as the king. He portrays Christ as the king. So a king has to have, what differentiates a king from his subjects? The authority, right? So he puts a lot of emphasis on authority in Matthew. So when he writes, he says, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28 and 29, when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at His teaching. And Matthew goes on to say why. Why were the crowds astonished at His teachings? Matthew explains that. He says, For He taught them as the one who had authority, full stop, no full stop, doesn't end there, not as the scribes. You see that? So Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, verse 28 and 29, the crowds were amazed at Jesus' teaching. Why? Because He taught them as the one with authority, not like the scribes. He had the authority. So when Jesus spoke, He did not refer to the authorities. He was the authority. The difference was the scribes, they had to refer to the authority, but Jesus was the authority. And there was a big difference there. And that is why the same crowds who heard the scribes and the same crowd that heard Jesus, they were astonished and amazed. They were like, this man teaches with authority. This is unlike anything we've heard so far in our lives. He has the authority. And they were simply amazed. And that is why even at the end of this chapter, we see that people held him as a prophet. And that is why these Pharisees, they could not arrest Jesus. They wanted to arrest Jesus. If you look at verse 45, the verse says, at the end of this chapter, they knew that Jesus was talking all about them. They knew it. As I said, they were smart people. They were not dumb. They were smart. They were able to analyze things. They were able to understand things. And all their questions did not stem from ignorance. It stemmed from hypocrisy. And Matthew outlines the authority of Jesus here. I love the Gospel of John, outside of the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When you look at the book of John, John had, unlike Matthew, had the whole world as his audience. He tries to portray Jesus as Son of God. While Mark portrays him as the Son of Man, and Luke portrays the servant aspect of Jesus, John portrays Jesus as a Son of God. And a Son of God, again, just like the King, has authority because he is God himself. And I love the series of 7 that you'd find in the Gospel of John. You would find the 7 miracles. You would find the 7 discourses. You would find the 7 I ams. And John says, I've only outlined 7 of each of them. But if I were to write everything that Jesus did, this whole world would not contain it. That's his closing remark. It's not because Jesus did only 7 miracles, but 7 is a picture of completeness, fulfillment. And I want to tell you that he is the perfect miracle doer. He is the perfect embodiment of God. Just to outline the perfectness of the Son of God, I've outlined all these things in 7. But if I were to write everything, the whole world cannot contain it. And even in his miracles, the 7 miracles that John handpicks through the inspiration of the Spirit, outlines different aspects of the power of God. He starts with turning water into wine, the power over nature, and he ends it with the raising up of Lazarus from the dead, which shows his power over death. O death, where is your sting? Where is your power? Because Jesus has power over death. He has power over nature, over quantity, over quality, over life, over diseases, over demons, over death. And ultimately, what John is trying to portray is he has power over everything. And that is Paul's word too. His power is exceedingly incomparable. We cannot even understand what his power is. It's like how the physicists talk about, the power of the power that could be generated, from the heart of a dying star, that kind. It's not that kind of a power. This is all a creation of God. So the one who created all these things should be infinitely more powerful than any power that we can imagine in our mortal minds. He's so powerful. He has all the authority. And due to the constraints of time, I'll not go through the next 2 parables, the parables of the 2 sons and the parables of the tenants. I'd like to close my words here, but then I'd like to, for each of us, to look into our hearts as we leave out and ask ourselves this question. Have we submitted to this authority of God? The Pharisees here, in spite of seeing all things, they were blinded because of their hypocrisy. They didn't want to see the authority and the power of God, Jesus, who was right in their midst. They were talking about Sabbath even when the Lord of the Sabbath was in their midst. They were talking about God even when the Son of God was in their midst. They were talking about the prophets even when the fulfillment of the prophets was right in front of them. My dear brothers and sisters, God's authority is God's right to demand unqualified obedience from his creation. We are all his handiwork. We have been created in Jesus Christ. He is the author of our life. And in the days, months, and years that he gives us, Let us continue to submit to this authority. Let us continue to live a life of complete obedience, to live a life that pleases Him, so that one day when we are in His presence, we could be called as the good and faithful servants.